At the end of this lecture, I like to touch a bit on technique and craft. What is technique? And what's the difference between art and craft? Now, one of the assignments that I'll give you is learning how to knit a scarf. Now, some people would say, wow, in a class on aesthetics, suddenly you're doing arts and crafts. That's a craft. And I like to bring it up because some people might think it is, and we'll look at some possibilities with knitting and looking at when does something that is a craft start becoming artful and start becoming an art. Yeah. So it's good to understand the difference between art and craft. And there is a divide that happens between those two things. Let's first tackle this idea of technique. Here's a quote. This is by Rikyu, who is a Japanese flower arranger. And I like this quote because he's talking about flowers, where he said they should appear just as they do in the field. You cannot achieve that by simply taking flowers and sticking them in a pot. It takes real technique to make flowers seem natural. In arranging flowers, you remove everything that is unnecessary in order to strengthen the composition. You might think the more material that is used, the greater the value of the composition, but the opposite is true. The less there is, the more forceful the work. Yeah. Now, we could just replace all of that talking about choreography, yeah, where we can want movements to appear as they do in nature, that it takes real techniques to make things look natural. To make a dance look like it just happened for the first time, not like we've been rehearsing these steps thousands and thousands of times for our entire lives. Yeah, but I like this idea that the thing that allows us to know what to do is our technique. Here's another quote. An artist must have specialized skill, and this is called technique. He acquires his skill just as a craftsman does, partly through personal experience and partly through sharing in the experience of others who thus become his teachers. The technical skill which he thus acquires does not by itself make him an artist. A technician is made, but an artist is born. Yeah. So this is a fascinating quote here because I like the fact that he talks about teachers. How so often in the worlds of art, we have mentors. We have people that we've learned from who have shown us how to look at materials, how to put materials together. And that's an ongoing tradition in the world of art. And this idea that we don't just make an artist, we can make a technician, teaching people put this with this, with this, with this. But there's something different when you get to that point where you're making a work of art. We tend to see that. I could teach you lots of studies, but it's fascinating when finally you can make a work of your own, where you pick the conceptual parts of it and you start assembling them. And that's a point where we start to really see how much the person knows and what they happen upon with their technical abilities to choreograph and to make works. Yeah. Here's the rest of the quote. This is by R.G. Collingwood from a really fantastic book called Principles of Art, where he says that great artistic powers can produce fine works of art even though technique is defective. And even the most finished technique will not produce the finest sort of work in their absence. But all the same, no work of art, whatever can be produced without some degree of technical skill, and other things being equal, the better the technique, the better will be the work of art. There's a reason why Renoir is so beautiful. There's an incredible technique there that we see in those paintings. So I love that idea that we see the greater the technique, and this idea here in the middle of this quote that you can produce art without technique, but we do need technique, and eventually we need strong technique in order to sustain us as artists. Now, technique provides the artist with an understanding and an ability to build the forms that house the feeling of a work. It teaches us how to manipulate the materials and how to put them together. Yeah. And if we think of the metaphor of a building, it's like their technique is like the foundation of a building. Its solid technique gives us structure, it gives us stability, it gives us logic, functionality, efficiency, and practicality. It gives us a way with how to deal with the materials, the first function materials, how to put them together so that they satisfy the needs of the form. Yeah. A student recently told me, I want to make a ballet piece. So it's really important to me that people see the beautiful art of ballet. Yeah, so when they were talking about it, I could hear that they were wanting to show that ongoing technical tradition of what is ballet and what is that technique in that. They just didn't want to just express themselves or do what they wanted to do. They wanted us to see those technical skills. Yeah. So technique provides the artist with even a vision for seeing what the end thing here is going to be when you're just looking at a solid piece of jade. All right. And in dance, we have numerous techniques, and a technique is like a language. It gives us the words with which to communicate. It gives us the way that we can, and even rules for what to do. Ballet has rules. There are things that we like in ballet, and so that's what that student will grapple with. And they know very well what those aesthetic goals for that form are going to be, and through which the art can then be made. Okay, craft. So craft is literally the ability to make things by hand. That is a craft. Yeah. So if you learn a craft, usually if we have a fantastic, you can talk about my scarf. This is a Burberry, I'm in Burberry today. So you can say, oh, the craftsmanship of those clothes is fantastic. I just love Burberry, like this. And oftentimes with things that are expensive, we can sometimes pay for its craftsmanship. That happens in bags, that happens in cars, that happens in things that are often manufactured as well as, they are crafted, So, we can also talk about craftsmanship when things are really beautiful, when there's in the detail of objects. Now, also with art, we do talk about art as a craft. We can talk about the craft of the actor to transform and create expressive characters. We can talk about a painter's craft to create beautiful brushstrokes and expressive lines. We can talk about a choreographer's craft to, organizing shifts of weight into effortless organic movement forms. We can talk about those things as a craft. And that's fascinating. Yeah. I often think what a dancer does is being able to take the movements and integrate those movements onto their bodies, their instruments, with the necessary expressions. That is the dancer's craft. So it brings us to that question, is art a craft? And is a craft an art? And those things can get kind of messed up. You should know traditionally the arts and the crafts were two separate things. That's why even in our building, we can talk, or our college, we talk about the fine arts rather than the craft arts or the practical arts. That gets back to that idea of aesthetic purpose. So those things were separated, even though now we will blend the lines of those things more. But it is a fascination with those. We do mix these words up a bit between art and craft. What is artful? What is an artisan? What is a craftsman? And we sometimes will honor things if we think that, oh my God, this is so beautiful. I might say the craftsmanship of it, you know, the ability that that person made this by hand is astounding. So anyway, we can mix those up. Here are Collingwood's 6 principles of craft. These I want you to know for the test because they're important. They're important for me in deciphering what is the difference between an art and a craft in its traditional sense. Yeah. And Collingwood was onto something when he dealt with these, because he said that a craft is a series of steps. You know, we know the steps to get from A to B. If I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I can then get to 6. Yeah, that it is just the same steps in that same order to get a result. Yeah, now that's true. Think about a recipe. You tend not to go to the back of the end of the recipe and work backwards. Never happens. Yeah, you always want to say, okay, let me start with this. Let me start with this. Let me follow this in this sequence of events. Yeah. Number 2, that within a craft, there is always knowledge of what will be produced, and there's an understanding of how do we produce it. Yeah, that's great. So if I use knitting as an example, yeah, if I'm making a scarf, I know I want to make a scarf. I know the series of steps, that's 1. And number 2, I know I have a knowledge of what I'm going to produce at the end of it. Yeah, it's kind of strange and rare in a craft to get halfway through and then decide, oh, let me do something else. I'm not going to knit a scarf, I'm going to knit a sock. You know, it's a little strange. You can do that, but I would say as a knitter, you often don't do that. If you're going to make a scarf, you make a scarf. If you're going to make a sock, make a sock. You know, and you can't go unless you go completely backwards and go back to square one and unravel it all. Yeah. Number 3, I can show you a scarf, and you can work backwards. You can figure out what that is. Yeah. So if you're good at knitting, I could show you a sock. I could show you a scarf. I could show you a sweater, and you can say, I know what they did. You know, I know now I can read the pattern. So there's usually a way to work backwards from the end and know how to get, how they got to do all those steps. It's a little different in a painting. It's a little different in a dance. Like it would be hard to know, oh, I know what that choreographer did. They started with this phrase. They started with that phrase. It isn't that programmatic as we were talking about, John Hosper's, that it's programmatic in that way that we can program it. Yeah. 1, 2, and 3. Number 4, there's usually a raw material. All right. So we know what that is. The raw material of a scarf is usually yarn. You know, that there is a yarn that makes this scarf. And oftentimes we don't get creative with the materials. If you were going to make a scarf, you'd go to the yarn store. You often would not go to, you know, the hardware store and say, I think metal thread might make an interesting and a great scarf. Now that you're starting to get artistic with that, where you're changing the materials, the traditional materials. But what he's saying is there's usually a traditional raw material of a craft. Yeah. Now he also says that the raw material is the same. You haven't often in a craft changed it too much. Now that we can interpret that a little bit, but if I use the scarf as an example, and all of you, I've ordered knitting needles, so you're going to be making a scarf. But with a scarf, I can decide halfway through to go backwards and the raw material. So the raw material is the same at the end. It's just been transformed with all the loops, but I tend not to have changed it too much with a raw material. And he thought that that was important for a craft. And then finally, The product of one craft can be the raw material of another craft. So I like to knit. You know, I didn't knit this Burberry, but I like to knit scarves. I'll show you some examples in another video. But I have another friend and she likes to knit, and she liked to knit so much, she finally decided what I'd like to do is, I live in Oregon, let me go to pick up sheep, you know, find someone who herds sheep, let me get the wool from the sheep and I will make my own yarn. Then I can take the yarn that I make and I can knit my yarn. So that one craft is the raw material, the product of one craft, her weaving, her spinning, is the raw material for the other craft, her knitting. Yeah, so those are kind of great to look at. Collingwood's principles of craft. Yeah, and he thought that that made it different than the arts. Yeah. Now, I'm going to show you this picture. This is completely not fair to put these two things next to each other, but let me do it anyway. Here, this is a Vermeer painting. Vermeer only made about 33 paintings. They are not huge, but they are so precious and valuable. If you're ever in Amsterdam, you should go to the museum there. You can see a great many Vermeers. Yeah, Dutch painter. Yeah, I'm putting this next to something that is obviously something that's been crafted. This little bird puppet made out of a paper bag. Yeah. Now, someone could say that's beautiful. I can imagine if a kid made this for me and just said, "I've made you this," and you think it's really beautiful. I love the orange and the green and that. But the question is, I mean, if we get to Collingwood, you know, if everyone did these series of steps to make this in a class, Collingwood would say, we see all the steps, we see the formula for this to make this, much like those, you know, like in school when you make the turkey out of your hand, and that those things are great and they're fun, and they can have such sentimental value to it, and someone can say that they're art. You know, like if they'll say, I want to frame it, I want to honor it, I want to treat it like a work of art. The question often is, though, like when we look at this, is, you know, Vermeer's in a museum. Is that chicken going to be in a museum? Probably not, but it might be in someone's personal home museum. But for Collingwood, he was really interested in where those separations were, and he was afraid that if we made everything art, we would lose knowing what art was, what the depth of why a Vermeer was important. So I would say that's the thing for you to think about as you encounter these differences. Even a knitter might not say, "Oh my gosh, Louis, you have created a sock." I would probably tell you, I've made a really fantastic sock, but and it might be even artful, but the Romans created the sock, not me. So anyways, sometimes we will use those honorific terms, and like I said, sometimes we will switch up the terms artisan, you know, for someone who's and craftsman, and we'll talk about incredible craftsmanship in art, and those are things that we do. My final thought in this lecture, when talking about craft and technique, is this: practice is important. And that's an important thing, because I've never known an artist who isn't passionate about their technique and passionate about their practice of their art. You know, so here is Camille Pissarro, who says, "It's only by drawing often, drawing everything, drawing incessantly, that one fine day you discover to your surprise that you've rendered something in its true character." Yeah, and that's just kind of a lovely thing. This is Bruce Jensen. Let's end with him saying, "It's possible that the best art is the result of those who bring to the work the best craftsmanship, the clearest vision, the truest spirit, the most creative mind, and the most talent, and of course, the most diligent work ethic.